Could I start off also by thanking Dr. Cross and the Vermont Council, Jael Stevenson, who sits over there, for a very warm welcome to Vermont. Before I start to talk about oil and gas and climate and the energy, can I tell you one practical thing? Although there's a bit of distance here, I have to tell you that I was born with a lazy eye, so it's only the left one that works. So if it looks like I'm constantly looking out of that door, it's just the way I was constructed. And it can be a bit confusing. And my ophthalmologist had told me that I have to tell every audience that I speak to which eye that works, otherwise they will be very, even more confused. The other alternative is that I have to have surgery, but the same ophthalmologist says that middle-aged male psyche is a very fragile thing. So you shouldn't make any more changes than what you can handle after a certain age. And he says, this is more than you can handle. So I got to tell you instead, the left eye is the one that works. Before I say something about, I thought I should speak for about, if 20 minutes is okay, and then afterwards we can do some questions and try some answers. Could I only briefly say that Norway has the population of Alabama, almost down to 100 individuals. We are the size of Montana, almost down to 1 square mile, and we have the volume or the economy of Massachusetts. Normally, people are mostly impressed with a third of those things, more than because Alabama is only 4.8 million people, and Montana is a big place, but it's a big place. But a lot of the territory is where very few people live. We make our living. Norway was, for most of our 1,000-year history, dirt poor. We were the poorest country in Europe up until Western Europe, I should say, up until probably at least the late 1920s. Some people argue 1932, we were still arguably the poorest country in Western Europe. And we've been ruled by our neighbors for most of the 1,000 years. We run ourselves for a while, back in the Viking area, and then we had 500 miserable years under the Danes. Since the Danes are not here, I can say that. And then we had 100 maybe not so miserable years under the Swedes, but it was basically miserable. The only reason why you haven't heard about Norwegian poverty is that we didn't starve. Like the Irish who starve, because you don't starve in Norway if you're willing to eat fish. If you're a vegetarian, you would probably starve to death for most of Norway's history. Because what we eat is immensely based on fish. When I grew up in the 60s, there was, we had fish for supper at least 5 times a week. And where I come from, most people still do. Doesn't matter, if your standard of living has increased, you still eat the same thing. And remember, in the 60s, we didn't know that fish was so healthy. Now it turns out it's very healthy. And it's become a major business for us. As I said, we make our living out of oil, gas, and fisheries. And out of those, basically, and then there are a number of other, of course, sectors of society, business, etc. But I will focus on oil and gas and how they relate to the environment, or energy, how they relate to environment. But I'd like to leave you with this one thing, that the business that is growing, the one thing that is growing the most for us, is sustainable fisheries. So think a little bit about that, when we come to the environment questions. And actually, the fish stocks in the North Atlantic is growing. Fish stocks are depleting almost all over the world, but not in the North Atlantic. Not in the North Atlantic. And it's not an easy part of the world. We have to manage these fish stocks together with the Russians. But they actually, I have to tell you, do an excellent job in looking after their fish stocks. And we have trouble having the fish respect boundaries. So we're stuck with having to look after these stocks together with the Russians. Last year we doubled the quantity of fish that we sold in America. Americans eat an incredible amount of salmon. And we would like you to eat more, but we will have a big campaign next year to have Americans eat more white fish, which we think is even more healthy. But although that is a second and a large and a sustainable sort of a way of economic activity in our country, oil and gas and the energy sector makes up more than 25% of GDP. It pays for this suit. It paid for the ticket coming up here. So for us, energy is the big issue. Now with energy comes a number of dilemmas that I was hoping I could mention some of them for you here this afternoon and take some questions. Because if you're trying to actually be green and sustainable, the energy sector poses some major challenges. But they differ over time. When I grew up, hydroelectric power was not considered a green way of producing energy at all. It was actually considered pretty anti-environmental in the sense that you destroy the countryside, you build big dams, rivers would go dry, etc. Today, those voices, I feel, is not as strong anymore, and many people consider hydroelectric power one of the best ways of generating energy. We cover 100% of our electricity is covered by hydroelectric power. Everything. Which is, of course, an immensely privileged position to be in. So no matter what we do with our oil and gas, we will never use it to generate electricity. Electricity in our world is per definition hydroelectric power. And I think we more or less have what we need. There isn't any greater needs. Rather, we should try to save on how much electricity we need. So we plan for a future in which hydro will cover everything. Then you're stuck with oil and gas. And the first principle there is never to subsidize oil and gas in order to encourage consumption. So Gail and I drove by a gas station this morning, and I noticed that we pay 3 times as much for gasoline in Norway as you do in Berlin. 3 times as much. A lot of that is carbon tax, but we had tax on it long before anyone talked about carbon tax. So it's actually expensive, $12 per gallon or something like that. And there isn't a revolution over $12 per gallon. And I'm not arguing that you should pay $12 per gallon in America. There are enormous distances here and things are different. But we've refused to start to take into the equation with energy and the environment the fact that we produce oil and gas ourselves and actually could subsidize it like some of the countries do, or that you create a different price level. Our price level is actually higher than the European countries, which doesn't produce any oil and gas at all. Our oil production is going down. It used to be significantly higher than what it is today. We're down to something like 2.3 million barrels per day. Our gas production is going up. We haven't found a lot of new resources for a long time, almost 15 years. But the thing that helps us is technology that makes it much easier to get more out of the reservoirs. And so, 15, 20 years ago, you could plan only for half of what you now can get out of oil and gas reserves. All our oil and gas reserves are offshore, and all of them are, by definition, owned by the state, by the government. There's no private ownership of the resources as such. Supply and services is a major business for us, and there are many, many small companies involved in supply and services in the energy sector. But producing companies boils more or less down to one company, which is Statoil, which is, even by international standards, quite a large company. And that is, again, 2/3 owned by the state. So by the end of the day, and many people tell me this in America, we are sort of a government-run economy in many ways. Some will say it's half communist or socialist or whatever. I wouldn't agree with that. I don't think that's relevant anymore. But the big actor in our economy is the government, which makes it easier, of course, to introduce new policies, because you can, there are not as many actors as there would be in an economy with a lot of different actors. Now, what do you do? I mean, we cannot, to be very honest, we cannot plan for a future which would use more oil and gas. We have to start thinking about other alternatives. And the one thing that frightens us the most, and I'd like you to think about this, is that we live in the part of the world that is physically changing the fastest. We live in the Arctic, and the Arctic ice is melting and it's going away. The US Navy is planning to sail a Navy ship straight over the North Pole in 2013. There will not be summer ice on the North Pole. That frightens us, to be honest. That frightens us. We are used to that there is ice on the North Pole, but we're facing a future where there will be no ice. So if you have the climate skeptics that doesn't really believe that all that many things are changing, we find very hard to believe. The physical, just the fact that the world changes so rapidly physically, we're absolutely convinced that it's due to greenhouse emissions and all these things. Severe weather and all the other dilemmas that comes with it. Now, although we've been lucky and we've found a lot of resources and probably become what you could call a rich country, we cannot do everything. The one thing, however, that we try to focus on is carbon capture and storage. In America, that is very often called clean coal, if you look at advertising. Now, we struggle to understand what clean coal is. But we don't use coal in Norway. I mean, we use hydroelectric power, a little bit of natural gas, but coal really is almost like a non-entity for us. What we want to capture carbon out of is gas. We want the natural gas to capture the carbon, store it under the seabed, and utilize the gas after you've taken it out. That is a huge investment. And of course, we hope it can be applied to coal as well. But that is probably our main contribution to trying to make the world greener. We think that we have taken a lot of the upfront costs. It has cost us billions. And the technology is there to do it, but not on a commercial scale. Not on a commercial scale. A lot of things can be done in small quantities, but you cannot yet do it for large oil fields. When there is a breakthrough there, the world will really have moved forward. Another thing we're trying to do is wind. Solar is not, we have a lot of bad weather, so wind is better than solar for us. Wind is likely to be offshore and in these huge floating monsters, which are going to be much larger than anything you have seen on land, and linked to the grid or the system that you have offshore from the different oil installations. For us, that is probably the other way forward in renewable energy. Huge offshore windmill parks in the North Atlantic that is linked through the infrastructure that is already there. It's a bit into the future, and the investments are enormous to get it going, but at some point that will be a major source of renewable energy. I should try to stay out of American politics, but of course we were disappointed when there was no climate legislation. and we were lobbying quite hard. A very good thing about America is that everybody, even foreigners, is allowed to pitch in. I mean, any good quarrel in America, you are welcome to participate, because Americans, in a way, like to quarrel, and Congress is, yeah, I wouldn't say. But of course, we were disappointed that there was a climate legislation. And I will confess to you that for us, of course, the heart of this is, but people here in the auditorium might argue against that, is that you have to put a price on carbon. Pretty much it boils down. You could think of different kind of systems, but we find it hard, in a sense, even to go into this equation unless you actually, at some point, try to put a price on carbon. One other major difference, and here I really think the Americans are much better than us, this is that you really believe in technological breakthroughs. I mean, in Europe, it's very hard, and I come from a northern skeptical Protestant society. We find it hard to believe in miracles when we don't live in biblical times. But Americans actually believe in major technological breakthroughs. And you have reason to do that. I mean, the internet came out of if not the blue, all of a sudden that came along, Microsoft, the software. So the belief that technology actually will solve these kind of problems fascinates me, really. It's a harder sell on the other side of the ocean. We probably believe or argue more for defensive measures, that you have to cut emissions and save energy and work on those kind of things. But here, the belief, and as I said, I have some respect for that there will be major sort of technological breakthroughs that will help us solve some of these environmental issues. Yeah, it's, as I said, it's not only fascinating, it's probably necessary in a way to believe it, because we really need. One thing there is that a lot of the technology actually works. It works, but it doesn't work on the scale that we need. As with the carbon capture and storage, I have driven a hydrogen car, electrical cars, they all work, but it's just that you cannot build a system that in a way that can sustain it. And there seems to commercialize these kind of things. That seems to be where the main problem is. The future, we will stay. I cannot stand here and say that we will give up our oil and gas production. We will keep producing oil and gas, and the United States will need to import carbon products. It's very hard for us to imagine at least the near future when the United States would not do that. We will keep producing it, but we will keep looking for these other solutions. We will, as I said, focus on the things that we think we can make a contribution. We will have to live with the dilemmas that you're at the same time a large energy producer, decreasing the oil production, but large hydroelectric power output, large gas producer also for the future. We buy and we make offsets, if you're familiar with the international systems for this, the different quotas, but money can't really solve all these problems. We will have to solve them also differently. A worry at the end, and then I'm kind of a talking head, so I'll stop now, but I want to make one point. One thing that really worries me is that there seems to be more and more difficult solving major international issues by getting everybody to agree. If you take a look at what the UN has tried to do over the last 30 or 40 years, we're now down to almost no success story in bringing together all the nice things that we studied in the 70s and the 80s, that if you bring everybody together, everybody will actually feel that they need to be part of a solution, that you want to be, that you don't want to be the spoiler, or you don't want to be the one that walks out of the room. It's been a while since one has been able to get everybody on board on anything. And these large international conferences, they tried in Copenhagen, which was actually very disappointing. It didn't, well, something was achieved, but not a lot. It seems to be built into our time that it's harder and harder to get everybody to agree. You could make a cynical analysis and said that if you go back to the Cold War, I mean, the world was a more disciplined place. The US would bring its allies into line, and the Russians would bring their into line, and by the end and China was weak, so by the end of the day you'd get some sort of rotten compromise. Those days are gone. And that there is, of course, you can say a lot of good things about that, but when more and more states, when more and more actors have a say, not only the states, but you have civil society, you have businesses, you have all kind of groups, the price of that sometimes, can at least appear to be that it's very hard to agree on anything at all, and then nothing will happen. That is, at the moment, I think that is, we will see what they will achieve in Cancun and other places, but that seems to be, if there was one major worry that I'd like to leave you with, this would be it. A little bit about, if you allow me, just a little bit about our, what we do with the oil revenues. We save 96% of the oil revenues. For a long time, we had no problem spending the money because we paid our debts. Norway didn't have a lot of debts because we were so poor that probably people didn't want to lend us money, for good reasons probably. So there wasn't all that much debt to repay, but there was some. But at some point, we had more or less repaid our debts, and since all of it is government money, it would destroy the local economy if we pumped it into the economy. So what has happened is that we save 96% of it, we take out 4%, which helps finance our healthcare system, our pension system. Every year we take out 4%. The 4% comes out of a philosophy pretty much like this, that if you look at an investment over, let's say 2 generations, 60 years, 4% is maybe a decent figure for capital investment return adjusted for inflation. I know that that will not, that will not impress a lot of people who are in the financial business. They'll say that we can give you much more than 4%. But if you take a 60-year perspective, or a very long perspective, and we try to think also way into the future, that we've settled on 4% is what you can take out of the fund. 1/3 of the fund is here in America, but as I said, it's going to finance our pensions. Private wealth, there is not a lot of in Norway, and in such an economy as I've described to you now, and with the energy resources we have, it's very hard to become sort of an individually rich person. We have some, but compared to a place like the US, very few. I'm overdoing it now, but you could basically say that we get free healthcare, we get a pension, and we get free education, and then we get pocket money for the rest. And even that pocket money is taxed 50%. So to build a private sort of fortune, Norway is not your place. It's hard. It's very hard to build that up. And probably, most of us, or almost everybody, would agree that we really don't encourage that. We probably view that in slightly different terms than at least some quarters. So we live off that. We get these free services, and then you get, to buy a tie or to basically run your life. But to a lot Norwegians don't have a lot of money in the bank. So the pension fund is then the buffer for the future. For at some point, maybe oil and gas will be worth nothing, and then we're gonna, hopefully we're gonna help our budget with the 4% or so that would come out of the fund. When Obama got the Peace Prize, which was in itself quite the thing, but he flew to Norway and I accompanied him, and he told me that there were two things he was interested in. One was our healthcare system, and I will say nothing about that, but the secondly was this pension fund, because he thought that it would be impossible to protect it, that people would want to spend the money that's in there. You want to spend the money. You could do a lot of good things with the money that's in the fund. But so far, there seems to be almost national consensus, not completely, but at least I'd say 75% probably of 75% would support that we keep up the 4%, that we only use 4% of the fund. Of course, based on the philosophy that we're just turning a natural resource into a financial resource. That's all really that happens. We're in a peculiar situation. You know, as I said, we're not really used to look after wealth. This is also something that for us, it's almost like sort of a moral dilemma, because you have a nation that basically been poor forever. Then it's very hard to get used to wealth, and in particular wealth that you can't use for much, because it would destroy whatever else we're doing. And you cannot just sit down and live off interest rates. Nothing will happen. You'll go brain dead very quickly. So it's a new situation for us. Also has its downsides. Not only on balances, of course, it's a good thing. Our problems are minor to many others, but there are some dilemmas even there. And some of them has got to do with how do you look after the environment when by the end of the day you also produce carbon. I think I should stop there, if that's all right. And then I'd be more than happy to take questions or criticism or stunts. The people of Vermont are normally, what I hear is that they speak their mind. And please do. And Burlington not the least. Yes, sir.
Mr. Ambassador, you've touched upon fisheries, hydrocarbons, the environment, all of which involve arrangements and agreements, regional or beyond regional. If you were to list the three most important foreign policy concerns beyond these arrangements that Norway faces, what would you say those problems would be, looking at it through the eyes of the foreign ministry?
I would argue that we have pretty much the same problem that the US has got. I would say that in our time, the major issues are global. And if we leave the environment aside a little bit, that I spoke mostly about, I would argue that you would find them in issues like international health. I mean, the AIDS has in a way disappeared a little bit from the headlines in the West. But I spent a lot of time in Africa, and the reality there is very, very, very different. We're hoping for a vaccine for malaria. People are dying of malaria and these kind of diseases which you really should not in 2010. So you've got these global issues. I also happen to think, and we happen to think, that global poverty is a major issue. By the end of the day, we will, in the rich world, in the Western world, only be able to sustain our way of living by getting other people out of poverty. Now, almost everybody that have come out of poverty has done it through their own means. But we believe that a little bit of development aid, a little bit of sort of reaching out a hand actually will facilitate that. But I'm not saying that you could pour money into the third world and they would get out of poverty. That's far too simplistic. But we would still see that there would be a role for that. So we give out 1% of the gross domestic product to foreign aid. And I would argue that it's not hard to find good ways of using that money. And if you can't use it for anything else, or if you don't believe in anything else, you could do it for healthcare. The one thing in international healthcare which really worries us the most at the moment is maternal health and newborns. The most dangerous 24 hours of any individual's life on this planet at the moment, if you look on average, is the first 24 hours. It's the first 24 hours. And maternal health is a big issue. Big issue. And there we are trying some schemes that many here might not agree with, For instance, we have projects where we pay women for delivering babies in a facility, in an institution, whether it be very modest or be a hospital in the third world. Pay cash. Cash is an enormous incentive. And it has the effect that it empowers women itself. If you give cash to women, they in a way get, at least for a time, their own kind of economy, and it's a huge incentive for doing it. But some people find that. The other night I spoke somewhere, and someone vigorously disagreed that you should use cash and pay women for delivering babies in institutions. But I would say that still those kind of global issues is and global sort of imbalance is still enormous issues. So we face in a way the same problems, but of course from different angles. Yes.
You've mentioned technology and education and healthcare and such. Comment about your institutions of higher learning.
Or higher learning?
Yes. Are you putting money into those?
Yeah. Yes, we struggle with. Of course, we didn't have our own university until 1814, and my daughter goes to an institution abroad that was established in the 1200s. So we came in late because, as I said, we were poor, and basically we had to go to university in Denmark for hundreds of years. Our oldest university was 1810 or something like that. So places of higher learning is hard. You don't build them very, very quickly, and we have a small population and they're spread out. So we depend in a way on open borders. We pay a lot of money. We have a government-funded program. There's a loan arrangement, and you get pretty large grants for going both abroad, and education in Norway is free. And of course, with such a small population, it's hard to have centers of really of excellence. We have in some fields. Some of them has got to do with things like maritime sustainable fisheries, marine life, these kind of things. I actually think we're pretty close to world leaders. But there would be others where we couldn't compete. So you will have to focus on certain things. But we do educate the population as much as we can. Education is, as I said, free. But almost all schooling is public. There are very few private schools. But we face the kind of problem that I think we touched upon it somewhere else this morning here in Burlington, that a lot of young people leave Vermont for a period of time, and then they come back. You try to get them back when they're 35 or so, which might not actually be bad. You cannot educate everyone here at President Finney's college, or maybe you can. But so we have to be a bit selective. But any small society faces those kind of things. I'll give you one other example. Healthcare, we think we have a good healthcare system, but it really doesn't make sense for us to build up specialized medicine, for instance, for diseases or medical conditions that we would have, let's say, 2 or 3 per million. We would have 10 or 12 a year. Those we actually buy services in America. That's very expensive. Very expensive. But we fly, for instance, newborns, we launch birth defects, and they're treated in New York. And we pay the cost of those things. And that makes sense, because to train medical personnel where you have only, let's say, 2 or 3 per million a year would probably not make sense. You have to have a critical mass in order to keep the capacity up. But any small society, I'm sure Vermont also faces the same kind of things. So you have to adjust. But then there are a lot of advantages by being small also. Our social contract is slightly different than others when it comes to these things. Yes?
As I understand it, when it comes to healthcare, there has been some privatization in healthcare. Can you speak to that with regard to
Very little.
But private hospitals have sprung up?
No.
No.
We don't have private. No, I don't think we have private. Well, we might have some that is run by a found. No, I don't think that one. I'm pretty sure that they're all gone, or if we ever had any. We have one, like in the UK, National Health Service, and basically everybody, it's compulsory. You know, I know this sounds so horrible to many, but you know, we are forced into one large government national health insurance scheme. And of course that means that you in a way queue up, but everybody gets the same treatment. And you cannot buy your way. If you want to buy medical services, there are some available for, I think the best example would be cosmetic plastic surgery, because the National Health Scheme will not pay for that. Only for medical plastic surgery, if there's a medical case. Cosmetic, you would not. So there is some for that. And if you don't want the National Health Service treatment, you have to go abroad. But I hardly know anyone who's done that. I don't think that's maybe a very few, but for that. So private healthcare this is one of the things which, you know, healthcare debate in America is fascinating, because it boils a lot down to cultural issues also and ideological issues. How wedded are you to that you have to have a choice?
Exactly.
And in our system, and I'll be fair with you, there is not a lot of choice. You cannot choose the physician that you want. Well, maybe you can if if you argued, or maybe you could, but you can't do it by paying money or some. So we're all in one system. So in a way, many people are fascinated by our healthcare system, but it comes also at a price. And one of them is that if you really are wedded to that, you should be able to choose your own healthcare, which actually many Americans are across the board. You really want to be able to yourself decide where you want to go for treatment, etc. Then our system won't work. But if you then want such a system and the choice, you will have a very expensive system. Nothing is for free. Nothing is for free. Yes, at the back.
How do you see the undersea territorial claims developing in the Arctic?
Yeah, that's a good. You might be thinking about the Russians planted the flag on the North Pole. Well, the good thing about being a Norwegian ambassador is that we don't claim the North Pole. The Canadians claim the North Pole, the Danes claim the North Pole on behalf of Greenland, and the Russians claim the North Pole. We don't. We modestly stop at, I think it's 86 degrees north. Or something like that. Well, the law of the sea, the Arctic is a sea surrounded by land. Antarctica is land surrounded by sea. Many people make the comparison, but they're completely opposite. So the law of the sea treaty, which we really hope that the US at some point will ratify, and I think the chances are pretty slim, but we really hope that at some point the Senate will ratify law of the sea. But the US implement law of the sea, meticulously. And the Navy nobody respects law of the sea treaty more than the US Navy and Coast Guard. But it's hard to get the Senate along. So the claims are in a way there already. I mean, the 200-mile zones, etc. But the thing that what the Russians did was in a way a sort of a public relations stunt or gimmick. It didn't change their claim. I mean, the Russians have had this claim for forever. I used to be the desk officer for these things in Norway in 1984 to 86. And the Russians haven't changed. The Russians don't change all that much. They've had the same claim all along. So I think actually that territorial part of it is done. There are some outstanding issues. For instance, the North-West Passage, I would say in the war, where the US and Canada might have slightly different positions, and we then wisely have none. Although we can speak about it for a year. But, and there are some other issues. I don't really think that the territorial disputes are going to be the hardest. I fear more for the environmental issues. What if there's an oil tanker that collapses on the North Pole or in the ice out there? It's a nightmare. These are areas where there's going to be darkness and there's going to be ice. and search and rescue, what kind of capacity do you have? And this will be the shortest route from the Pacific to the Atlantic. And when it's possible to use that route, I mean, maritime shipping will come out over the North Pole. Very little capacity that is up there in the Arctic. Well, most of it is Russian. I mean, when you speak about the Arctic and the North Pole, when everyone speaks about the Arctic, 50% of the Arctic, the coastline, is Russian. So very often when people speak in general, when they really are speaking about Russia, 90% of the population that live in the Arctic are Russians. And I can understand the Russians a little bit. You know, when they have 90% of the population, they should also have a say. But I haven't said that the Russians should have more power. I will humbly leave that to those who claim it. The U.S. also doesn't claim the North Pole. That would be a stretch up from Alaska. That would be the only. But there's an outstanding Canadian U.S. dispute in the Beaufort Sea about where the limit is. We sold ours with the Russians. So it's signed. It needs to be ratified. But we're hoping we'll go through in the next months. So we have negotiated with the Russians for 30 years. 30 more, almost 4 years. It's a huge area, 155,000 square kilometers. So we don't have any outstanding territorial disputes in Europe. The Russians have an agreement with the United States as well, but it's not yet ratified in the Venice. Yes.
I think your comment about the inequality perception in the U.S. versus Europe is the key issue. I think in the U.S. we can tolerate inequality at much higher levels than in Europe. But I'm wondering, comparing Norway versus Sweden, you have dynasties in Sweden like the Wallenbergs. And how are you different within Scandinavia in that, apart from the fact that you were post-colonized, but now considering the current common socialist tendencies there?
First, I think I shouldn't speak about American politics, but inequality in America is, in a way, at least for a foreigner, slightly of a different issue because you import so many people. I mean, there will always be more inequalities. That the United States still is a place that have massive immigration. I mean, you have immigration on a scale that we wouldn't dream of, and we really wouldn't know how to handle. And probably with that will also come inequality. So I'm trying to be a little bit sort of humble about it. But you're absolutely right when it comes to your point about the differences in Northern Europe, because although we speak almost the same language, the societies are very different. I mean, it's true that Sweden still has an aristocracy in a sense, and has been independent, has been a wealthy nation for centuries compared to us, and has a much broader industrial base and a much more sort of developed economy and a diversified economy. We have the products that we have, and a lot of it boils down to energy, oil, gas, and fisheries. And our good fortune is that those things are in enormous demand. I mean, we were really lucky, miserable for a long time, and then very lucky. So the differences are great. We never had better relations with the Swedes than what we have now, and they're by far our largest market and the most important sort of partner for us. Denmark is also different. As I said, a much, in a way, more developed society, closer to Europe, etc. We were the poor corner, and we lost 2/3 of our population during the Black Death in the 1350s. 2/3 of the whole population died, and you could argue that we're still recovering. It took away, the state basically collapsed. There wasn't anything. So that the Danes took over and ruled us was that we had nothing. We had a little bit, the Catholic Church. This is pre-Reformation. We had a little bit through the Catholic Church, but that was about it. When Reformation came to Norway in the 1530s, 1540s, it took 100 years for people to find out that they were no longer Catholics and had turned Protestant. Nobody knows. Nobody told our population that they were Protestants. I don't know. The priest went on the same way, and I don't know. Nobody could. It was, you know. But at some point, I guess, over the centuries, it sunk in that we're Protestants, and then we became pretty fierceful Protestants. And you can see a reminiscence of that out in the Dakotas and Minnesota. Garrison Keillor. Weird. He makes fun of us. He likes to make fun of us. Yes?
There's been a lot of stories in the news recently about genetically modified salmon, actually in particular. I'm wondering, sort of, is this seen as a good thing, or seen as something that will detract from a major source of income, or what's the perspective?
The fish farming people are always sort of technically advanced and are looking for but this deep skepticism. I don't know enough to say anything about it, but it's not something that we have neither on the table or any plans about the future. You could say that that's easy for us to say because we have a large industry to protect, but those kind of things actually frighten us a little bit. To start that's but you know that's maybe a natural sort of conservative and hold back attitude. Yes.
This is back to the global issues and how global partnerships would possibly solve them. And I was wondering if Norway's opinion on strong separation of civilian and military affairs in civilian operations such as Afghanistan. How do those affect transatlantic relationships?
Yeah, you got very good. Have you done research on this? Because this is a very good question and a difficult one for me. So you're reading on whoever teaches this.
What's the question?
Yeah.
The question was how the strong situation of civilian and military affairs and civilian operations affect transatlantic relationships.
We are probably on the orthodox side when it comes to that these things should be separate. Easy for us to say, many would argue, because we have a strong tradition of keeping them separate. And that, for instance, we had a pretty large operation in Afghanistan before there were any troops there. And if you can't do it through any other organization, we would probably do it through the Red Cross, particularly international ICRC, International Community Red Cross. So we are skeptical, and I know that there are others that have different views, that actually you can do two things together, or that it's a good thing that you do it together, and you could utilize the military for development aid or for humanitarian relief. We would be probably far out on one side of those. I could make a long sort of explanation of that. It does affect, of course, because we will have to find ways of operating with those like in Afghanistan who does not share our view. And some things, minor things we do to our military, per capita we have one of the highest rates of soldiers in Afghanistan. We have 500. And that's hard for us, because if you look at where Norway is, we have a large navy, a very large coast guard, an air force which is not insignificant, and almost no army. Well, there is an army, but you know, the army was never our thing. No, Navy is in a way our thing. So the army is, but in Afghanistan, of course, it's army territory, and we found that very hard because we had to send in people. A lot of those that we sent to Afghanistan are from the Navy. It's not their natural environment. If you normally serve on a frigate or a Coast Guard ship in the Arctic, and they send you to Afghanistan, that's a different thing. But that's the only way we can do it, because we don't have these kind of expeditionary forces. A lot of the people that we killed also come from the Coast Guard and the Navy, not from. But I said we're rather orthodox and actually believe that in the long run you're better served by trying to keep them, if not separate all the time, but at least to have an awareness and try to keep them separate, and that will have the best effect. But I'm Very good question. These are excellent. These are excellent. It was in the 60s. We didn't find anything for the 60s. And it was an American company that founded first Phillips Petroleum, then of Oklahoma, now part of Phillips. No, and the truth is that we nicked or stole or were given the technology from American companies, more or less. And when we found the oil, we had very little. We had hydroelectric power, etc. So we have learned, we have learned all these things from big oil. So we have a lot to be thankful for, maybe more than many Americans would like to say, for companies like Exxon and Conoco and Chevron, because they've all been there. But then, of course, they were given licenses with strings attached that they had to train local capacity. We set them in an army of engineers. So our expertise is built up to a large extent by the Chevrons and Conocos and Phillipses and the Exxons of the world. Shell, BP, Total, French. So that's where we had nothing. It came out of those, most of it's probably American. American oil companies are very popular in Norway, and it's probably more than here. We think we have strict safety standards, but I will tell you that they're in compliance. It's a different regime than what you have in the Gulf of Mexico. I wouldn't claim that it's necessarily better. It's just very different. But we have the knowledge had to come from somewhere. Most of it came out of here. And although we taxed them 90%, they're still around. And I should speak for American oil companies, but I don't believe they would be around until the midpoint. Is that a fair assumption? I think they're for-profit institutions. Yes?
Do you have any nuclear power?
No. And again, very easy for me to say, I could be very self-righteous and give you a long speech that nuclear power is terrible and horrible. I think you have a discussion in Vermont now about prolonging of some plant that's coming up to the 40-year mark and whether you should do another 20 years. Am I on thin ice now?
You're correct.
Something like that, yeah. We don't have it. But again, we really didn't need, because we could come up with 100% hydroelectric power. And then it was very easy to say that, we don't like these monsters. The Swedes have them, and if we run short on our hydroelectric power, we get it from the Swedes. So, I should be careful. The Finns are building the 2 largest nuclear power plants in the world and are very happy. My French colleague tells me, he's a good man, he tells me that if he could have 100% nuclear for electricity in France, they'll probably do it. I think they now have 70, 75. They're in that region and would like to go to 100. Nuclear in America is a different story, and I read with interest. And I'm eager to learn what role nuclear will play in your energy future. Well, I should shut up now about that. It's for you to decide. Yes.
Has any research been done in wave technology, utilizing the sea? Wave technology for utilizing the sea to generate electricity?
Yes, but I'm not sure how much we do ourselves. I'll have to, if you make a note, I'll try to come back, and I know I really don't make it up with some of them, but I think you realize some of it. Sorry for that answer. Yes? Yeah, it's my strange eyes. Okay, yes, please.
You seem to be skeptical about the international community to solve this global warming issue. Do you have an alternative how we can go about this issue? Or do you want to solve it by continent or what?
I'm sorry if I didn't mean to be skeptical. If it was possible, I would absolutely prefer it. I'm just afraid that it won't work. But we will have to try again. I'm just disappointed after Copenhagen, and I look at the record that many of these conferences seems to have failed over in the last decade only. If we could one global
sort of treaty would absolutely, in a way, be the best. And I really don't have an alternative. But that everybody should try also to have their national schemes. One thing that we're trying to do is, I don't know if you're familiar with RED, which is the Rainforest Initiative, that we're actually, in a way, contributing and paying developing countries not to chop down their forest, because they're very important. But you can only ask them to, do that if someone is willing to come up with money to preserve their rainforest. I don't have a good alternative. The best would be, of course, a global agreement. But I think that's probably going to be hard. So maybe a global understanding would help, and then and could be implemented. Because if you're going to have to ratify these things everywhere, then it's going to take a long time, and it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard. You probably heard that I pleaded for the U.S. Senate to ratify Law of the Sea, but we're struggling. And even if you have the votes, they have to find the time to do it.
Let's do just two more.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's fine.
Yes, my Norwegian uncle tells me that now roughly 20% of the working age population in Norway is on disability of some kind, or is not working. I don't know, I've been able to check that for myself. I'm sure it's rather high. What is the government doing to sort of maintain or prevent the culture of Norway from changing significantly with the dramatic increase in social support that's coming?
Medical disability is a huge problem for us, and far too many people is on it. And it can't be 20%, but far too many is on and it actually is a large problem, particularly in remote areas where our official unemployment figure is very, very low, 3% or something. So it means that if you actively want a job and you're willing to move a little bit, you will get one. I'll get you a job. But medical disability is in a way out of the workforce. And we have higher and higher retirement age. We will probably, the retirement age is now 67. And we have linked retirement age to life expectancy. So when life expectancy go up, retirement age will go up. So the 67-year-old cannot, in our system, plan on being able to retire. And in some private and also the public sector, for a while, you have people who could retire all the way down to 62. And those things are going to be gone. And I cannot really envision a lot of people retiring at 65 either. And 67 will come under pressure. We will quickly move towards 70 years. And there of course, you have also the issue. The only way that out of the system is medical disability. Now, for a large part of the workforce, they would like to work until they're 70. And if you ask, many people would. And many people think it will be fear that you could leave the system also, not without a medical disability before you're, say, 67, and very quickly 68, 69. But we have actually decided that even with the kind of economy and oil money we have, we can't afford it. We are graying, the population is graying. We really don't have enough young people. Although we have replacement rate, which is much better. We have almost replacement, almost up to 2.1 child per woman. We're not yet there, but it's almost there. But women get 1 year. If you get 12 months maternity leave with 80% pay, 90% pay, 89% pay, which is the only way we have found out of really trying to make replacement pay. You've got to pay people for this. Otherwise, you won't have enough pay. But the pension system on the other end, and this may find this harsh, that you're expected to work probably until you're 70. And so the medical disability is then the only sort of way out of the system. So, if I'm around, I'll probably have to do something to go on 7. One more word, yes, you'll have one.
Sorry, last one about your hydroelectricity. Are there many of the upstream rivers that originate in Sweden? And is there any
was a ridiculous answer, but it's not a major problem. I think there might be you, but it's really yacht yeah. You should do the river. I think it's all good. Otherwise, it's not easy. And if there